Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Erica Austin. I am here with Dogwise, and today I am joined by Ken Ramirez, the author of the book, The Eye of the Trainer, which is available at dogwise.com. And I'm telling you guys right now, there's only like 20, 25 copies of this book left at Dogwise. So if you don't have a copy of this book, go get a copy. I'm also going to be giving everyone who's watching a coupon code to save 20%. It'll be at the end of this live stream, so don't miss that. Ken, I'm so grateful to be here to talk to you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Erica. Thanks so much. I look forward to chatting.
I'm so excited to be here. Anyone who's joining live, we really like this to be a ongoing back and forth Q&A. So if you have questions for Ken, drop them in the comments. We'll answer them live. We also had several people who follow us on social media who asked questions ahead of time. So we've got those in our slides as well. But one thing I want to say about this book, I got this book years ago, and I was rereading it, getting ready for this interview, this Q&A, and I'm like, it is just delightful. It was hard for me to put this book down. Like, I had a moment yesterday where I was like, okay, I've bookmarked enough things to be able to talk about. And then I was like, one more chapter, one more chapter, one more chapter. And I was like, I gotta stop. I can't just read the whole book tonight. And then I woke up this morning and started reading it again because there's just some wonderful stories in here. And I have been truly lucky to be able to hear you speak at Clicker Expo and at other places and online. And it's always a joy to hear you tell your stories. But like Susan Friedman says in the endorsement of this book, reading this book is as close to sitting around the campfire as most of us are likely to get. And I'm hoping to provide the opportunity for the people who are joining live to get a little taste of that, sitting around the campfire with Ken and hearing some of his amazing stories. But Ken, could you start us off by telling us, how did this book come to be? What was the idea behind this book?
You know, it sort of came about in sort of an unusual way. I was in my role with Karen Pryor Clicker Training. I was writing a monthly blog or sharing stories online on a regular basis. And as I kept pulling these different stories out of my past and telling and sharing information about them, it prompted a new idea and another idea. And I realized that in my 50+ year career now, I've had lots of opportunities to have some pretty amazing experiences. And so I would write about them. And our editor for our website was telling me, Julie, she says, gosh, Ken, this could make a good book. It's just a collection of stories and a collection of information that you've shared. And so she pulled together a bunch of blogs that I'd written and said, like, they would be good in a story. We could group them together and you could share additional stories and things of that kind. And so we ended up having so much material that we ended up saying, okay, well, let's cut it back and share these particular stories. And so we ended up putting it together, and it actually came together relatively quick, just because I had written so much over the years, and we kind of pulled a lot of these stories from a variety of different resources or places that I'd written about them, or many times I'd told these stories on podcasts or other places, and we just started figuring out which ones would be of interest to people. And that's ended up how we ended up putting together The Eye of the Trainer.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that because this book is so much more than just like a memoir or a collection of stories. There's some really great lessons in this book. And it doesn't feel preachy. It doesn't feel like case studies of, let me tell you this story about an experience I had with a beluga whale and how you too can learn from it. It's just very relatable. Like I said, it's super easy to read, but the principles that are involved in the book, I think, are super valuable. We shared this on our social media page just a couple of days ago to promote this event. And the way that you describe reinforcement, it's simple, but it's not easy, right? And I really like these explanations where you're talking about, really, you've got to look at your animal's behavior if you want to see if your reinforcement is working. And if you're not getting the behavior that you want, something needs to change.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of the stories in the book are actually situations that occurred to me where in my travels as a speaker, as a consultant, as a trainer, people will often ask me questions about, I don't know how to solve this problem, or I don't understand this concept. And I would find myself sharing a story or telling them a little bit about it. And so a lot of the stories are about training solutions or training concepts, and my way of trying to simplify concepts, because we hear about things as trainers all the time, whether it's reinforcement or punishment, or whether it's about unusual tools like a keep going signal or an end of session signal. And people are always, trainers can be quite opinionated about whether these tools are good or bad or not. And I constantly have people saying, I hear this is a good tool, or this is a bad tool, or that I should use it or I shouldn't use it. And I tend not to be someone who gets so adamant about you absolutely must or shouldn't, but rather let's look and see what this tool is, why there's so much controversy about it, and how you can make a decision if it's the right tool for you. And I find myself often diving a little deeper into these different tools, and they end up making some pretty interesting stories, either from people that used them and failed, or people who used them and succeeded, or that have strong opinions about them. So I just enjoy writing about that sort of thing, and sharing those stories with others.
It is such a valuable resource. Like you said, you've got such a wide variety of experience. You've worked with, I would guess, hundreds of different species of animals. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But it's funny that you mention people trying to decide what tool to use or not, what technique to use or not in a training session, and just how strongly opinionated people are about it. It's amazing. I think, especially as someone who does social media management, seeing kind of the wars that are going on online, where people are debating and quoting or misquoting science,
Yeah.
which is a really interesting thing, because when I was reading through the book, you have a section of the book called "Is a Clicker Necessary? Should we
Right.
stop using it? Do we really need it?" And here's the really interesting thing, is I could not wait to dive into that chapter. But something that you really talked about in that chapter is the different scientific studies that had been done and how they studied different things. It's not,
Right.
is it effective? Is it effective for generalizing behavior? Is it effective for shaping a behavior? And I really loved how you were talking about, like, we really need to think about the scientific studies and read it and stay up to date, but also look at what the studies are studying.
Right.
I really liked this part. You said there's no magic in the clicker. It's just a toy noise maker. It's not something that we are having, it just because you're using the clicker, your training is magically going to get better, right?
Right.
You said in the book, the effectiveness comes from the way we use it combined with other tools. The click facilitates consistent, immediate communication. The accuracy of the clicker is based on our ability to observe behavior and react appropriately. And I underlined that quote because it really spoke to me of, you can put a clicker in anyone's hands, but it's just a toy. It's just,
Right.
It's not something that magically makes you a better trainer. You have to be able to observe the behavior and then respond to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a fascinating thing to see people get very, very passionate. Some of these studies about clicker use came out, and I reacted to the onslaught of criticism people said, because they felt like these studies were criticizing clickers and saying that clickers weren't any good. And I thought, I love using my clicker, and I think it's a very valuable tool, but I didn't take offense at the study. I think the study, you have to look at what a study was intended to do and look at what the results were. And sometimes you look at those results and go, okay, that makes sense to me. I wasn't surprised by the results, because so much about good use of a clicker and the benefits of the clicker come from how and when you use it, and if you use it for these various purposes. And it isn't necessary in all situations, but I think what happens is we get so passionate about something that we believe in that we immediately have a knee-jerk reaction of saying, I can't believe they criticized the clicker. And I think there's nothing. I can't believe I actually said knee-jerk reaction right there.
You did, right there in your book. I was getting ready to share this slide where you
That's
said
funny.
in the book, we don't have knee-jerk reaction.
people do that all the time, and they get very offended. And I often think to myself, hey, we should take a step back, take a deep breath, and say, what is it they're really saying here? And is this really a surprise to us? And
Mm,
oftentimes it's not a surprise. It's nice that there's a study that shows it. But then what it does is it helps us ask ourselves the question, all right, if this is true, why do I still use a clicker, and is it still valuable to me? And oftentimes, so far for me, I always come back to, yes, it serves a variety of excellent purposes. It is not the magic end all be all that's going to make someone a great trainer. There are plenty of great trainers who don't use a clicker, who don't use a whistle, who don't use a word like good, but still manage to shape behavior amazingly well. It's recognizing the value of the clicker and what it is that it does. It isn't something that everybody absolutely must use. It's just a tool. And if you understand how to use it, then you can use the tool better if and when you need it.
absolutely. It is interesting to hear you say that because I'm thinking about how often I try to put clickers in the hands of my clients and they're fumbling and they need some practice. And I think to myself, like, of course, this is a great tool, but I, as a trainer, have been reinforced for using this tool effectively with dozens of dogs and lots of species. And so my reinforcement history is motivating that decision a lot, where other people
Absolutely.
might not have that experience.
Absolutely. And I think once you've used a clicker and been able to communicate an idea or a concept to another animal, it becomes this little, like this ability to really have a conversation with your learner in a new way. And it's just
Mm.
another tool that really facilitates that. And why would you ever get rid of it once you understand how to use it?
Yeah, absolutely. This quote that I pulled from the book, it was funny that you almost started reading your own quote from the book, where you say, we do not need to have knee jerk reactions to studies where results differ from our own experience. It should simply prompt us to ask more questions. And some of the questions that you included are the study's findings scientifically sound? If so, why do they differ from my experience? Should I change my practices, adjust my understanding of the principles at work, or simply wait for more data and more information? I really appreciated that because I think that people are starting to throw around, well, the science says, the research proves, and we have to really be careful with that, especially because I'm finding more and more online, it's alienating people. People don't want to be preached at with
Right.
scientific studies and told you're wrong.
Right. And that's not, I don't think the reason that studies like this were done. They really are investigating a question. I'm curious to see how this will affect this animal's learning. And then when we see the results of the study, it's great information, but it's really recognizing what it is they were asking, what the conditions were in when they did the study, what dogs or animals they selected for that study and what's their past history. And sometimes it also has to do a lot with the skill level of the user and whether or not they
Mm,
took that into account. But it's still fascinating information. Even if it's not a scientific study, I love going to a conference, for example, where someone just shares their experiences and they have a strong opinion about a particular tool they used. And rather than have this visceral reaction of I love or I hate what they just said, I just look at it and go, well, that's interesting. That was their experience. And then is that experience the same as mine? Well, that's cool. Then we're aligned. If that experience is really different than mine, rather than be upset, I like to go, well, that's curious. I wonder why their experience was so different. And then I just want to learn more. And it just helps me recognize why it is that some tools fail in certain circumstances and succeed in other circumstances. With one animal, it works, and with another animal, it doesn't. It's really about gaining information from all of these different experiences and just adding that to your knowledge bank and going, okay, I that was a new experience. I had never seen that happen before. I'm going to remember that and I'll come back to it again later if I need that information. But I try to stay open to whatever someone's bringing to me. If they had this experience, then I want to listen to it and figure out what I can learn from that.
I think that's really great advice for all of us, because we do tend to get into those moments where if our experience or our values or belief doesn't align with someone else's experience, then it becomes a very right and wrong. And there can only be one right or wrong. But if our animals are individual learners, I think it would stand to reason that we are individual learners as well. And of course, we have different experiences and learning histories.
Yeah. And I think that's the kind of thing that prompted so many of the stories that I share in the book, because, I'm doing a consulting gig and I come to a client who says, I heard X and I don't understand that. And I find myself trying to argue or convince them about whatever it is they heard and why they may have heard it and why it is that people believe it. And whenever I hear something like that, where someone tells me that they've heard that this is bad or that this is really good or that they should do it a certain way, I always want to investigate further and go, okay, why is that? Why, what have other people said about this and why they use it? And then you tend to find that everybody's experiences are different. The context in which they use a tool is different. The animals they're working with are different. Even the types of training they're doing is different. It could very well be that what you need to have a calm, comfortable pet in your home is very different from what someone needs if they're training a search and rescue dog or if they're training a scent detection dog. The needs are different. And so the results from what you do may be very different because of the context you're using it in.
I was thinking about that when you were talking in your book about the end of session signal, where I've worked with some marine mammals, as I know you have as well, and I have dogs at home. And thinking about an end of session signal for my dogs versus, stepping away from the edge of a pool is very different. It's such a different context when you're working in a zoological setting, and the end of session could be really aversive to that animal,
Right.
as opposed to the dogs being like, yeah, well, the human is still here in the house with me. It's a totally different context, right?
It totally is. And that was why, for me, when I talked about end of session signals in the book, I talked about the fact that in my own career, there are times when I used one and times when I didn't. And both, I think, were the right call for those particular situations. And then the other thing that happens with tools like end of session signals is recognizing that there isn't a scientific definition of an end of session signal. It's just the words end of session signal. And we as English speakers can put those words together and we can use them in any way we choose, so that we might call this an end of session signal, while another trainer says, well, that's not an end of session signal. It's a start of enrichment signal, or it's
Mm.
a take a break signal. That means, and people have different meanings for them. And so inevitably what I've learned over the years, and I always tell people, is when someone says, well, I just used a jackpot, or I just used an end of session signal, or I just used a keep going signal, I always say, well, that's interesting. Can you tell me what that signal is? Well, how do you use it and what do you mean by it? Because it could very well be that their use of the whatever tool they're talking about is different from the way I would use that tool. And so after you hear what they do and you realize that it's very different than yours, you have a couple options. You have the option of saying, well, that's not the way I define that tool. And you can have a semantic argument, or you can take my approach, which is to go, oh, that's really cool that you use it that way. Tell me more about it. And I learn more about how they use that unique version of the tool. And there was no tool in the world that I've ever seen that is as controversial and is used differently as the keep going signal. There are
Mm.
so many different versions of it that when you look at the popular literature, there are dozens of different ways that people use a keep going signal. And some of them are so totally different, but you can understand how the words keep going signal made sense for what they called it. But if I just talk about it and you don't have a clue what I'm talking about, you don't know if you're thinking about the same tool as I'm thinking about. And so oftentimes when we have these discussions, it's really about saying, tell me what you mean by a keep going signal. What version of it? What do you define it as, and how do you use it? And then you can go, oh, well, that was really fascinating. I've never seen it used that way. Let me learn a little bit more about why it's that way. And so we just have to recognize that in the popular literature, in our popular culture, when we talk about training, we come up with cool terms that we think explain something that we're doing. And then that term catches on in a certain circle, but in a different circle, they use that term in a different way. And it's not worth arguing about. If you really want that term to become a part of the training lexicon, then publish a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, and suddenly that term will take on meaning. And even then, it will still have differences and people will use it differently. But until then, the words keep, going, and signal are not copyrighted words. They are words that exist in the English language. And so if you are doing something and you give your animal some kind of a cue that means you want him to keep performing, you might call it a keep going signal, even though it may not mean the same thing as what someone else uses it for. So that's a lot of the things in my book are about these kinds of confusions that I come across, or these arguments that I come across. And I'm often asked, can you settle this for us, Ken? Who's right? Is it him or is it me? Is it her or is it me? And who's the right one? And oftentimes it's like, you're both right. You both have good points. They're just different tools. You just gave them the same name.
Yeah, or you're applying the same thing in a different way. And like you said, in a different context.
Right.
In chapter 2, you talk about the confusing keep going signal.
Right.
And you do talk about jackpots and end of session signals. And like you said, there's some confusion about that. It's not a term that is agreed upon. We had a question that came from the audience ahead of time. And especially, I love this question because I know the person who asked the question very well. And she and I met at a conference, and she had never used a clicker in her life. She's been a trainer for 25 years. And she and I actually ended up playing Portal one night. I did a Portal, like an impromptu Portal night. And she was kind of like, what's that? And then she started watching and she was like, okay, let me try it. But I talked to her yesterday and she said, I still am afraid to use a clicker with my dog because I don't know that I'm skilled enough to do it. And in the book you talk about, it's really great to practice your mechanical skills in a different setting before you start using it with an animal. But she and I had really great conversations. I wouldn't necessarily call it debates, but really intense conversations at this conference, both with the two of us and then other trainers as well, while we were playing Portal, while we were discussing it, at the bar, like you do at a conference late at night. And her question was, do you think our dogs really understand the meaning behind jackpots? And obviously you can give that disclaimer that we have to define a jackpot and know what that means. I know that in her instance, there was we have a target behavior in mind. And when the dog hits that target behavior the first time, we're going to jackpot. We're going to give a whole bunch of magnitude feed, as the marine mammal trainers call it, a magnitude feed. And then we're going to end the session so the dog can realize that he hit the target behavior. And I said, I don't know that means what you think it means. Let's talk more about it. So what would you say to that question, Ken, of do you think our dogs really understand the meaning behind jackpots?
It's a great question, and it's one that I get all the time. Is a jackpot a useful tool? Is it important? Does it do what we think it does? And my first question usually is, well, what is it you think it does? Because it's a difference depending on how you define jackpots. In fact, one of the most interesting things is one of Dr. Jesus Rosales Ruiz's graduate students did a study on jackpots. But in doing his study, when she did the study, she sent out a survey asking people for definitions of a jackpot, and they got many, many different survey results back. And then she decided which term she was going to use, the biggest consensus around what a jackpot was. And the definition that she ended up using is not the definition that I usually see used in other contexts. And so most people recognize that a jackpot usually means a high value or high magnitude reinforcer. But not everybody necessarily believes that that means it's contingent on some particular criteria. And even in the definition or the way you just described it, that you and Heather talked about it, there was a part of your definition in there, which was, again, different than one that I would use. And so it's always a question of saying, tell me what you think a jackpot is and what it means to you. And there have not been a lot of studies in the animal training world on jackpots. Dr. Jesus Rosales Ruiz did one. There's a couple others that you can find. But each of the studies that I have seen use a different definition of jackpot. And there are lots of studies in the human literature, because certainly casinos, in deciding how they were going to reinforce people for playing the various slot machines and various games, came up with a ratio or a schedule for which they would occasionally provide a jackpot to a player who wins a big pot of money, but it's very random and it's very unpredictable. So there's no question that the way casinos make a decision about how often to pay out a jackpot is very well thought out. And there's been a lot of studies that have been done about it. And if you look at those studies, they have some really interesting information, but yet it doesn't usually parallel the way people think of using a jackpot. So the big question really is, what do you mean by a jackpot? And for example, someone would see me, for example, I love having a really super reliable recall. And so I will reinforce my dog with the highest quality treats and a high volume of treats. And I just rain on him lots and lots of excellent reinforcers for coming back immediately on a really fast recall. Someone would look at that and go, "Oh, you jackpotted that recall, didn't you?" And I would go, "No, that wasn't a jackpot." And they would go, "What do you mean? It was an awfully big reinforcer." I go, "I know, but for me, on a recall, I always give high value reinforcers." And so as soon as it becomes something that I do all the time, the question is, does that make it a jackpot anymore? Is that just a high value reinforcer for a particular type of behavior? And if it's always a high value reinforcer, is it really a jackpot, or is that just the expected reinforcement? And so some people use the term jackpot to mean lots of or high value, and has nothing to do with the rarity of how often you give it. While others say, no, I will give a jackpot for a breakthrough or achieving some desired goal for the first time. And to let that animal know, I will immediately give them a high value reinforcer, because the theory is it makes it more likely that they will do it again. But interestingly enough, in your definition, that when you were talking with your friend, you said that as soon as you give the jackpot, you end this, that's the end of the session. Well, that's another criteria that I'm not sure everybody would necessarily follow. So it's like, okay, that's a slightly different version of the jackpot. Everything else about what you said would be similar to what I would say, but I don't necessarily have that caveat of now ending the session at that particular point. Not saying that's right or wrong, it's just different from the way I might apply it. And so going back to Heather's question, which is, do dogs understand a jackpot? I think it depends on what you want the jackpot to mean. I think most people use high value treats and high value reinforcers to tell a dog or tell their learner that what they just did was excellent, and you hope that they will repeat it. And I think that there is a lot of studies that indicate the benefits of high value reinforcers. Those are not usually called jackpots. They're just called high value or high quantity reinforcers. And there is no question that the literature suggests that it does impact learning. But there can be a lot of questions about the learning. And for example, one of the things that comes up with a jackpot is, or with high value reinforcement, is some people will suggest that high value reinforcers can certainly increase the intensity of a behavior, but it doesn't necessarily increase the precision of a behavior. And so what a lot of people discover, and the way I kind of talk about it, is if my goal is to get my animal to touch a really specific spot, and I just use a very regular rate of reinforcement, it is likely that that animal's precision will stay really precise. But if I reinforce it with a high value reinforcer, oftentimes what you see is that the dog's enthusiasm is so high that all of a sudden their precision isn't good anymore. It's just bouncing all over the place. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And they can't do it as precisely. And so they find that a high value reinforcer might be a detriment to that. But if what you're trying to do is just get my dog to recall really fast, and it doesn't need the precision that every paw is going to land on a specific target, but they can just come at their fastest pace and they don't have to follow any particular precision or any type of precision, then it does work. It does really make that behavior stronger. So it's really about what you're looking for in the behavior, and it's also about what you define a jackpot as. And so for me, because I always reinforce a recall with a high value reinforcer, I don't call it a jackpot. I just call it a worthwhile reinforcer, a high value reinforcer for that particular behavior. And then a lot of information about jackpots is it's hard to study a jackpot, especially if you define it as contingent on a specific outcome. Because when you look at the literature in with human learners, it's not contingent on anything other than you pulling the arm or pressing the button on the slot machine. And every time you push the button on the slot machine, it isn't going to pay off with a jackpot. So the jackpot is just truly random. It is on this variable ratio schedule that is unpredictable. And so unless you're using it that way, you're not actually using it the way that a casino programs out a jackpot. And who's to say that the casino definition of a jackpot is the right definition? It's just certainly something that has paid off really well for them because people continue to gamble even though they don't win jackpots all the time. And so clearly they've thought it out and it works for them. But what I also say about jackpots is if you really did it that way, look at the people who are at a slot machine in a casino, and how often do you see them kicking the machine and cussing it out because it didn't pay off? Jackpots may serve a function, but they may create frustration. And so we really have to ask ourselves, is that what we want? Do we want our learners to be frustrated? So there's a lot of questions that revolve around the jackpot question. And I think they're still out there. I think there's still more work to be done. There's more definitions to hear. I'm always surprised how someone will define a jackpot for me. And I'll go, oh, that's another new twist. You just did it to me today. And I've heard hundreds of definitions of jackpots. And just that little nuance of, after you give the jackpot, you end the session so the animal can think about it. And that also comes from an interesting place where there have been studies about the last thing that an animal learned and how well they recall it and things like that. And so adding that to the definition of a jackpot makes sense, but not everybody has that in their definition. So I love it when I hear another new wrinkle to what makes a jackpot work or not work, or what people think makes it valuable. So I think it's a very interesting question. And going back to Heather's question, what I would say is we know that high value reinforcers have an impact on behavior, for sure.
That's a good, succinct answer.
And the question of whether you call it a jackpot, whether that's what it's serving as, is a whole different discussion.
Well, and even if that impact is desirable to the trainer or not, hearing you talk about the precision and, if you're maybe giving a high value, then your dog might not be as precise because of the enthusiasm. I was like, wow, Ken, thank you for the little consults that you just gave me, because I've been trying to figure out, like, what is going on with my dog where we're working on this generalizing a nose touch and he's just like hitting it with his chin and his neck and he's like whacking it. I'm like, what? Stop. We just practiced this in this context. Now do it over here. And no, way too high value of a reinforcer at that moment.
And who would ever think that you would say to yourself, oh, my dog is too enthusiastic about this behavior. It's like, usually you want that enthusiasm, but you realize sometimes that comes with artifacts and problems. And suddenly it's like, love the enthusiasm, but now I can't get my dog to focus on the precision that I need.
Yeah. And again, I think too it depends on what you're training. It depends on what you're training for. And if you're training agility, or I mean, I don't do agility, so maybe you need more precision than I'm thinking, but like, go fast and in the right direction. And that's what you really want. But having the precision, then you might need a different technique. I really appreciate that insight. I found this meme on the internet and I wanted to share it with you because in chapter 2, when you're talking about jackpots, you talk about the fix-it fish. And you talked about when you were a little baby trainer, dolphin trainer, working at a marine life park in Texas, and your experience with this fix-it fish, which was a mackerel. And it was something that the dolphins found to be very high value, and that the trainers would kind of compete to see who was going to get to like feed the mackerel because it was this, breakthrough. It was a really interesting tool. But hearing you tell this story about the fix-it fish, it sounds like you might not have known it first when you were a young trainer why the fix-it fish was working. And in your experience, have you talked to trainers who they're doing something, but they don't know why it's working? And does it matter?
Yeah, it does. It matters. But I would say that, my story about the fix-it fish, is that's what our team called it, was this, we only got 1 or 2 mackerels in an animal's diet per day. And you really wanted to wait and save that mackerel for when it was an important behavior. And as I was investigating the jackpot question, I found myself going back to the story about me using these. We used it as what we thought of as a jackpot. But then as you try to recall something that happened 50 years ago, are you embellishing the story? Are you sure? Do you really remember? Do you actually have that data to say that, yes, it actually fixed behavior and made it better? Or did it just look like that happened once or twice, and that became the myth that you carried with you and all those years later? I don't know. I can't go back and remember why. I mean, what I recall is that it worked really great, and that's how we used it. But that's the story I tell myself. I don't really have data to go back and back it up. And oftentimes, when people are talking about things that they do, we often will tell stories. I'm the master at it. I will often say, so I did this and it worked because the animal loved it, or because the animal whatever. And that's the story that I've told myself. And realistically, as a practical trainer working with my dog, if it worked once and I can repeat it and it worked again, I will probably keep telling that story. And as long as I'm doing that with this one particular dog, it probably is a true-ish version of what really happened. Where it matters, and when I say does it matter, is if I use that then to become factual information that I now teach to other trainers. And I see it happen a lot where really skilled trainers are able to do something. They don't really know why it works. And when asked, tell me how this works, it's like, well, it's because I have this energy and I use this energy. And as I come in and work with the animal, I convey that energy to my dog, and that's how he learns it. And of course, as a learner, you're going, okay, how do I do that? How do I create that energy? But that's the story that this trainer tells. And it's not like he's lying. It's not like he's making something up. It's that he doesn't understand the science behind it, but he's still a skilled practitioner. He uses this energy that he calls it, and it works. And it could be that by energy, he might mean a blend of his relationship and his reinforcement history and all these different things combined. But what you find is that trainer, excellent trainer, produces amazing results, but he cannot teach anybody else to do what he does. So he's skilled. He clearly uses the science properly. He just may not know that that's what he's doing. He gives it a name. It's this energy, and people can almost see it so that it's very believable, yet they're not sure how to recreate it because they're just thinking of it as this internal energy that they have to have, and they're not recognizing that part of that energy is excellent timing, is great reinforcement, is all these other things. And the reason he is a successful trainer is because he is applying scientific techniques accurately, but he probably doesn't know that he's following scientific techniques because his experience has been that when I do this with this kind of energy, it succeeds. And that success reinforces him to keep doing it that way. But he doesn't know how to describe it to other trainers. And I see that all the time where master trainers fail at being master teachers sometimes because they just haven't figured out how to describe it in a step-by-step process that is recreatable by another trainer.
It's interesting hearing you say that because when I was a brand new dolphin trainer, I would hear people talk about the relationship with the animal. And you just have to improve your relationship with the animal. And it was such a vague term to me. And I'm like, but what does that mean? Like, how do you do that? And they're like, well, I don't know. I just have a relationship with this dolphin or this sea lion because I've been working with them for 15 plus years. So you're just not going to have that relationship. You're not going to get as good of results because I have a better relationship. And Susan Friedman, who's very fond of saying, make sure you define your labels. When I heard her define the relationship as a history of reinforcement, I was like, oh, okay, I can work on that. And of course, we're not just talking about throwing fish at dolphins or,
Right.
bacon at dogs. We're talking about all the ways that we're reinforced as social animals and social learners. And I really appreciate that definition a lot.
Yeah. And relationships are one of those wonderful terms that we as trainers like to use because we all develop what we think of as a relationship with our learners. We love our dogs. We love the animals that we work with. And I don't think anybody would argue that there is a relationship there. But you're right. When you talk about, oh gosh, how come I can't do this? And it's like, well, you don't have that relationship yet. How do you define it? And yes, I've always used that same definition about it being about a shared reinforcement history. And people often go, but that seems so um, uh, transactional. I have relationships with people that are not built on reinforcement history. And I go, are you sure? Think about it. Why do you have such a good relationship with that individual? You go, well, because they're kind to me. I find them funny. I enjoy going out for a beer with them. And all of a sudden you list all of these things that you like about an individual and you go, aren't those all reinforcers? And if you think about why you don't like certain people, well, it's because they're condescending. It's because they're disingenuous. It's because they're mean. It's because they are rude. And all of a sudden, those are a list of punishers that you and while we don't think about relationships as being these transactional things, you give me something, I'll give you something in return, they really are based on what we value and get from our interactions with individuals that make them people that we care about, that we enjoy spending time with, that we want to do things with. And it's all relationships are all about reinforcement history. And it's when you define that it helps. And so it's when you come up with things like relationships, nobody would argue that relationships are important, but it's just about figuring out what that is. And it isn't just about how often have I given my dog a treat today, but did I interact with him with kindness, and was I thoughtful in setting things up where he lives and giving him good enrichment and having him a comfortable place to live and making sure that he gets to come in from the hot sun on a day. And all of these things add to this reinforcement picture that helps develop a relationship. And so with that other trainer I was talking about before, when he was talking about his energy, it's really about, okay, what does that mean?
Mhm.
I'm sure that there's something about, I believe sometimes with some of the dogs I work with, that if I'm enthusiastic, they give me enthusiasm in return. But if I really wanted you to learn to train that way, I would have to define it a little bit better and maybe figure out what is it about that enthusiasm that works well for that particular animal, because for other animals, that enthusiasm could scare them and make them not want to work well. So you really have to understand what it is you're talking about.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot with, of course, animals are individuals. And I volunteer at an organization where they work with highly fearful dogs.
Right.
And, being that exciting and enthusiastic would actually definitely be punishing or not be a boon to our relationship. In chapter 4, you said, who needs data? We all do. And you talk about this, but you talk about how like trainers are doers, but we're not great record keepers. I just had an interview with Milena De Martini and Patricia McConnell earlier this week, and Milena's work in separation anxiety, it's so much data tracking.
It
And
is.
it's not very reinforcing. It's not very, very like appetitive to do record keeping, but it can be reinforcing when you get really good results. And hearing you talk about like data is important for everyone. And that's something that I was reading about briefly in the book. We've got a question from the audience that I'd really love to hear your answer on. Mallory wants to know, what species that you've worked with do you feel was the most surprising that they took well to positive reinforcement training, or what was surprising about that experience?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think for me, anytime I'm working with a new species, you always have questions about, is this going to work, and what's going to be reinforcing to this animal. And I always try to work with people who know something about the species. Um, and so I'm not surprised anymore when it works, but yet I still am. I still get a thrill, like, oh my goodness, this actually worked. Um, Maybe the best example is something that I do talk about in the book, is when I got a call from this director of a botanical garden in London. They were putting together this special exhibition at their botanical garden about symbiotic relationships, and they wanted to create this huge butterfly garden, and they were really hoping that they could oh, there's a butterfly right there. They were hoping that we could train the butterflies to fly on a specific cue. The London Philharmonic was going to be playing this orchestral piece, and they were going to be doing this big gala fundraiser, and they were hoping that we could get the butterflies to fly across the stadium where this botanical garden had been set up. And she had been looking all over the community in Europe for a trainer who would help her figure out if they could train butterflies. And she kept coming across these people who would say, well, I don't know if butterflies are trainable or not, but you know who you ought to call? This bloke in the US. His name is Ken, and he says that he can train anything. And I've never actually said that, but I have often said that whether you're training an earthworm or a university graduate, we all learn the same way. And so they sort of assume that if I say an earthworm, that means I'm willing to try and train anything. So she ends up calling me and asking if I was interested in training butterflies. And I said, she wanted to know if it was possible first. And I said, yeah, I mean, if you know what they eat and you know what their sensory mechanisms are like, you should be able to cue them and reinforce them. So yeah, I think they should be trainable. And then her next question was, great, we're trying to get this trained for a summer gala. Would you like to participate and help us in the training process? We'd love to bring you on board as our training consultant. And I said, sure, that sounds great. And I remember being excited about it. Then I hung up the phone, and the first thing I thought when I hung up the phone was, oh crap, I don't know anything about butterflies. They're pretty, they fly. I don't know about what they eat, but I did have enough confidence as a trainer to know that they should be trainable. And so I knew that the botanical garden had these butterfly biologists on their team, and if they would be willing to work with me, we'd figure out what they eat, and we'd put the training on cue and really train a basic A to B behavior, or a basic come behavior or recall behavior and get the butterflies to fly from one side of the stadium to the other side of the stadium on cue. And I people see this and have heard about this, and they always go, "That is amazing." But when I think about what the training was, it was like getting an animal to come when called, which is something we train our dog to do from the very beginning. And if someone said, "Isn't he an amazing trainer? He taught his dog to come on cue." Oh, people would go, "You're crazy. Everybody does that." And that's all we did with the butterflies. But because it was a species that hadn't been traditionally trained, because I didn't know anybody who'd ever trained it, it became this major project that for me was going to be like, is this going to work? And when I remember there were two times that gave me these really chill kind of feelings, and we decided we were going to set up a basic stimulus pairing. We were going to sound a cue and then give them nectar, a bowl of nectar to eat from. So we would take all these bowls with covers on them out into the butterfly garden, and we would sound a cue, which meant nothing, and then take the top off the bowl, and the butterflies would then go and eat the nectar. And I remember we did that pairing on 3 consecutive feedings. And the first feeding, we sounded the cue, lifted the top off the bowl, the butterflies came and ate. We did it the second time, we sounded the cue, lifted the top off the bowl, the butterflies came and ate. On the third trial, the third session, just the third session, we sounded the cue, and before we took the tops off the bowls, thousands of butterflies all of a sudden took off from their perch, from where they were sitting, ready to descend on the bowl. And when that happened, it was like this eerie kind of weird thing, because all of these butterflies suddenly started levitating to come to the bowl. And all of us, you could hear all of us, there were like 40 of us all controlling different bowls going, ooh, because it was just like you saw them react to the cue after just 3 pairings. And it made me go, it sent a chill up my spine, because it was just so cool to see it work. I knew it should work, but it's just when you see it happen, it was surprising. And then we began moving the bowls, a few centimeters and meters, until eventually it was 100 meters away, and they would make this huge flight. So the first time that flight happened, that elevation of the butterflies happened, it was really a chilling kind of like, wow, this is really cool. Then the next time was 19 days later. We had completed the training. The animals are flying all the way across the stadium in this beautiful undulating fashion. And I'd been right there in the middle of it, and I was needing to come home to the US. And the team said, we'd like you just to watch it so you can see it. And so they sat me where the public was going to sit for the gala, and they played the music of a recorded version of the music that we were going to be playing. And they cued the butterflies to take off, and the butterflies, of course, they take off in this, they fly in this sort of undulating pattern, so that it creates this ribbon of color as they fly across the stadium. And I remember sitting there watching it and listening to this classical music piece play, and I got emotional. I brought tears to my eyes. I was like, I can't believe I trained this. But it was just a cool experience. And so when the question just came up, that's what it makes me think of. I don't think that I'm ever surprised that it works, because I have such confidence in the way behavior works that it will work. But it still pleases me and impresses me when I see it come together that way. And so the feeling is one of awe and inspiration, but I wouldn't say surprise is the word I would use, but it still is pretty remarkable and special when it happens. So
I really like that answer, that it doesn't surprise you, but it's still really neat to see. And
yeah, it's not like it's not cool. You're not like, you're not really appreciating. I really appreciate what just happened. And there's probably a little bit, there's always that question. You go down to train something for the first time, and you're going, okay, this should work. But when your dog or the animal that you're working with achieves the goal, there's this sense of accomplishment for you and the learner, and it's exciting, it's fun, it's thrilling. But I don't know that I would call it surprising, but yet we often react like, "Oh my God, you did it!" Like we're surprised, but it's really just the thrill and pleasure of seeing that communication with your learner has worked and you have achieved something that you'd set out to achieve.
Absolutely. I think also an unintended part of that story that as you're telling it, I read it, like I said, I read it in the book yesterday and was like, oh, and this, I want to talk about this part. And obviously we're getting pretty short on time, but hearing you talk about this is an unintended lesson I pulled is it's important to put the cue before the behavior, right?
Right.
Like you said, like presenting the bowl was the cue, or before even the auditory cue or the vibrating cue or whatever happened, they were like, oh, I know what that's about. And that's such a neat moment of like, whoa, there is an association happening. There is some learning. They are like, and like you said, if it can think, it should be able to learn. Like I've heard research about some plants that are showing what's now considered behavior, that they will move towards sunlight or away from wind or whatever it is. And it's just, yeah, like we know the science is there, but when it happens and you get to see it, it is a magical moment.
It is. And I would say I would actually be more surprised if it didn't work. But what it does tell me, let's say we had done this pairing of cue, bowl of nectar, cue, bowl of nectar. And after 4, 5, 6, 7 repetitions, we're seeing no response from the animals. Well, that just gives us good information. If we really believe the science that we know can work, the fact that it's not working tells me either the cue is not something that they can perceive, or what I'm offering as a quote unquote reinforcer maybe isn't a reinforcer, and thus that's why they're not reacting to it. Or it could be that I'm using a perfectly acceptable cue and a perfectly acceptable reinforcer, but the fact that I'm standing right there over the bowl might mean that I'm too scary of a thing to get them to want to fly toward me at this particular juncture. So it just tells me that I need to keep tweaking and changing the environment, changing what I'm doing. And that's how I tend to find solutions. I try something, it doesn't work. I don't doubt the science that tells me, cue, stimulus pairing should create a response. And if it's not creating a response, then there's something wrong with what I'm setting up, and I need to go back and change it.
I also really appreciate you mentioning that, because so many times the blame is on the learner. And one of my favorite phrases is the rat is always right. And I have learned that more times than I can count playing Portal with humans, where they're like, I'm so frustrated, I'm not getting it. I feel really dumb. And I'm like, trust me, if you're not getting it, I did something wrong. I set it up in a way that wasn't clear, that didn't have the parameters to help you get this easily. Like, it's my job to modify my training plan, my approach as the teacher, as the trainer. The learner is just responding to the environment. And so that's a really valuable point that you made of, I, as the trainer, need to look and see what I need to adjust. The animals aren't doing anything wrong. They're just
always
learning.
And it's one of the things I like about playing training games with a human learner, because I think being in the role of the learner, the animal role, is so enlightening, because you find yourself going, oh my goodness, I know the rules. We talked about what we were about to do, and I'm confused. I'm wondering whether my learners look at me this way, because it's such a great lesson. It's always about what do I as the trainer need to do to make this clearer? What am I not doing? What can I do differently? What do I need to change?
Leanne has asked the $1 million question, Ken. Is there any video of you training the butterflies?
There is. I keep telling everybody when it's going to come out, but I don't know for sure. It was filmed for a documentary by the BBC. And we did this project now over 10 years ago. The documentary got put on hold first because of some contractual disputes between the BBC and the company that filmed it, and then it got put on hold because of COVID, and they had other programming they wanted to put forward. I am told that that it's going to be released as a documentary in the very near future. But I just don't know when yet. It's out of my control. I have seen it. It's wonderful footage. I can't wait for it to be available. I am certain that when it is available, you'll hear about it on my social media. You'll hear about it somewhere, because I'll make sure that because I have the rights that once it's shown, I can rebroadcast or re-show it myself. So I wouldn't doubt that we'll show it at a Clicker Expo. We'll show it at a class here at the ranch. There'll be a number of different places where I'll be able to show the documentary. So it is beautiful, beautiful footage, high definition, great footage of these butterflies flying across the scene in front of you. So I don't think you can find the footage right now, but you will be able to find it sometime in the hopefully not too distant future.
We will wait patiently. I know we're running short on time. I've got just a couple of questions left for you, Ken. In your book, you talk about your elephant. I should probably find out exactly what you call it. I'm pulling open the pages. Your elephant project, your elephant conservation project. I've heard you speak about this at Clicker Expo before, but something, if you are for some reason living under a rock and don't know who Ken Ramirez is and haven't heard of this story, go read this book. It's really good, because here's the thing is I've heard you talk about your elephant conservation project a couple of times now. And I will say, from a personal note, every time you give the numbers and the updates annually, I sit in the audience and just cry. It's such a touching, amazing, impactful work that you're doing. But I had never heard the story that you write about in the book. And I'm not going to tell anybody. Everybody who wants to hear the story has to go get the book themselves. That's the teaser trailer. But I'd never heard this story before that you wrote about in the book. And I'm so grateful that you shared it, because I've only heard the last maybe 3 or 4 years of updates from you about how that project is going. But I had also never heard of conservation training before. And we did have a question from the audience. Micah wanted to know, where do you really see conservation training going in the next 10 years?
I think the possibilities for conservation training are unlimited. I think the beauty of conservation training is just the fact that we as humans are having such an impact on the lives of animals living in the wild. Because of building, because of pollution, because of use of space. And oftentimes conservation projects come up because of the human-animal conflict of an animal is used to living in this environment. Humans are now living in this environment, and there becomes conflict. And conservation training allows us to be able to use remote training to change an animal's behavior, to help an animal find better resources, to help an animal find water, find food. I think the things that we can accomplish from a training, using our training in conservation related issues, it's a brand new field, and it's just becoming better understood and better known. So I believe that the ways that we can use training to solve conservation issues, to help relieve conservation pressures, are almost unlimited. It really requires some imagination, some understanding of the challenges that animals are facing, and then we have to find solutions that help the animals without getting in their way, without disrupting the natural flow of things. But most of the conservation projects that I've been involved with are working with animals in their natural element. They're not in zoos, they're not in managed care, they are in free-ranging habitats, but we are finding ways of adjusting the environment that helps these animals be successful, helps these animals survive, helps these animals avoid conflict, so that they and us can live together. Because unfortunately, that's the challenge we're facing in our world today, is we as humans are occupying spaces that maybe we shouldn't be. But once we're there, we've impacted the natural flow of things for that particular species. And if we're not going to remove ourselves from that situation, which in many cases it's often too late, becomes a question of how can we adapt our behavior and how can we adapt their behavior so that we can cohabitate successfully. And so I think the promise for what conservation training holds it's really limited by someone's good imagination and what kinds of creative solutions we can come up with. If you read some of the stories of some of the conservation projects that I've been involved with, they're very, very different. They're not it's not a one size fits all. It's not even the same. We're not even always trying to solve the same problem. There's a variety of ways that we approach conservation training, and I'm involved in something like probably a dozen conservation projects right this very minute, and some of them come to fruition and have great success, like the Elephant Project has, but it came at a great cost. And I think that's probably part of one of the stories that Eric is talking about is how this what we had to go through to get permission to do the project and what happened as we were trying to set up for the project. It's not always easy, and many of these projects take a great deal of patience, a great deal of ability to work well with others, because inevitably we are working with government agencies, we're working with environmental groups, we're working with biologists, we're working with educators, and we're working with the animals, and we're trying to make decisions, oftentimes requiring permits, requiring a lot of careful thought, requiring environmental impact statements, and all of that takes time. So this particular elephant project, which did not officially begin until 2018, we began the project in 2009, starting to investigate possibilities and look through, and that was 9 years of work before we actually were able to start the project. And so when you embark on something like a conservation project, it takes time to complete the project, but it takes a lot more time even to get the project off the ground. By the time the conservation elephant project, the migration project that I'm working on is done, officially done, and our permit is over, it will have been 19 years of my life dedicated to this project. So it's not like a quick, oh, go and do this, blow a whistle once, reinforce now, and it's done. It's really a lot of thought and effort has to go into it. But once you come up with a solution and you find a way to help wildlife succeed in whatever you're trying to do, it's an amazingly reinforcing thing, because you see it helps the animals. It makes you feel better about our involvement in that particular animal's life. And I think there's a really good future for it. But it's still one of those things that wildlife biologists are not always familiar with it. But because a lot of the projects that we've been working on over the last 20 years are now making their way into scientific publications and making their way into print, now there's more evidence, mounting evidence, to show that these kinds of projects can work, and there's a lot of evidence of them being very successful. So I think the next 10 years, I just see it booming and exploding as we find new ways of being able to help wildlife.
It's interesting to think about what we think of as training, click, treat,
Right.
feed the
Right.
dog right in front of you, but being so hands off, not having
Mhm.
the reinforcer available. And I remember when you were speaking at this most recent Clicker Expo, you said the thing about the Elephant Project is we get one repetition a year. And then we get to make an adjustment. I mean, talking about, like you said, 20 years and all of the thinking about it and coordinating that goes into it. So what I took away from you saying that is that you need imagination and to be able to work with people, not just work with the animals hands-on, which you won't be able to do in conservation training, but really developing those relationships with people and having that good cooperation.
Yeah, the every year when we work on this elephant conservation project, there are over 250 people involved, from government agencies, park rangers, tribal villagers, volunteers, university graduate students who are doing studies. It's a real complex network of people that have to all agree on this approach that we're taking. And part of the 9 years that got to there was having to be in court, having to talk with various environmental groups and various conservation organizations and various tribal nations to try to convince them that this was going to be beneficial to the population, beneficial to the species. It's a tough one, because so often I talk to young people who want to become trainers, and And oftentimes I'll say, well, why do you want to become a trainer? And they'll say something silly like, well, because I love animals, but I hate people. And I always say that that just doesn't work. It's very rare that you're going to get a job as an animal trainer on a deserted island where there are no people. You are always training for a client, you're training for something. And this conservation project is amazing because you're working with animals in the wild. You don't have direct contact with them, but you're doing things to that environment to help shape behavior. But it's all about the relationships of working with these various individuals. Every single year, I am constantly dealing with with activist groups, with researchers, with conservation biologists, with park rangers, with tribal leaders, with volunteers from various tribal nations, and we're getting everybody to work together toward this common goal. And it's all about people management. It's about being able to convince people that what we're doing is important, that it needs to be done a specific way, and you need to be able to really use your best people skills so that we can help the animals that we're trying to help out. So there are so many things that are necessary. It's the least of which I used to do a talk saying, uh, wanted animal training consultant. Those good with animals need not apply. And that's and the thinking behind that title was, of course, you need to be good with animals, and yes, you need to understand training. That is a critical skill, but you will fail at whatever you're trying to do if you don't have these good people skills, these good organizational skills, these good time management skills. There's so many things that are necessary to make something like a conservation project be successful, and it's so few of those are really the animal related skills. They are important, of course, but it's I see it whether I'm talking about becoming a veterinarian or becoming whatever. It is all about the people skills. I always tell veterinary prospects, people who want to become veterinarians, that the animals may be your patients, but the owners of those animals, the people, are your clients, and you have to be able to get them to buy into whatever medication you're prescribing. They have to be willing to listen to whatever care plan you're going to give. It's all about people skills, and if you don't develop those, you're not going to be successful as a trainer.
It sounds like we have to work on our reinforcement strategies with humans as well. That's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
People who are interested in learning more about the conservation project, there's actually a really great list of websites and organizations in the book in chapter 5. So there's really some good resources in there for people who want to learn more as well. I've just got one last quick question for you,
Okay.
Ken. I'm going to combine this. We had a couple of questions that were very similar, including if you wanted to give advice to the next generation of trainers, what would it be? But I'm going to boil it down. Nikki sent us a question that said, what is one thing you wish that every animal trainer knew?
It's hard to boil it down, but I am going to boil it down to one thing. But I could list 100 different things that I wish every animal trainer knew. But I think if I were to give advice, I would say learn how to read your animal's body language. So much of being successful as a trainer is being able to recognize when an animal is excited and thrilled or when an animal is nervous and scared. It's very, very important that if we want to be successful as a trainer, that we create a comfortable environment for our animals. And so much of that is about learning to recognize what our animals are trying to tell us. And that's ultimately about being able to read our animals' body language. And so it surprises me that I say that. If you'd asked me that question 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I don't know that I would have said that. I think there's so many things that we need to know to be able to be a good trainer and to be successful as trainers. But when you're not able to recognize when your animal's trying to tell you that they're upset or when they're nervous or when they're frightened or when they're scared, if we can't recognize that, we don't have the ability to create a comfortable environment for them to live in. And so it boils down to really being able to understand our animals and be able to read what they're telling us and be able to have that conversation with them. And so if I had to say it's one thing, I say it's understand how to read your animal's body language. Learn as much as you can about that.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because so many of the interviews that I've done, really people are focusing on emphasizing understanding specifically canine body language. But I often ask, dog trainers, what's your favorite book or what's your favorite resource for canine body language? And I've got Lily Chin's book, Doggy Language, on my shelf.
Mine's right up there.
Yeah, it's got to be within quick and easy reach. And actually, Ben left a comment early on saying, I love seeing lots of shelves of books in folks' backgrounds online. That's one of my favorites as well. But being able to grab those resources, I did not prepare this slide for this conversation, but Dogwise has a sale going on 3 really big body language books: Brenda Aloff's book, Barbara Handelman's book, and Roger Abrante's book, which Ken has got just ready to grab right there. This is perfect. Yeah, go get yourself these 2 books that Ken's showing you right now to answer Nikki's question of, what do you wish every dog trainer knew? What do you wish every animal trainer knew? They're all those books are on sale right now.
And there's that one too.
Doggy Language is so good. It's such I think that I pitch that book every single interview I do. I'm like, everyone should have this because it's something that like kids can read, and right. It's so approachable. It's so easy. So it's great to hear you say that, because that is absolutely something that we try and encourage. There's so many resources out there now, and learning, yes, go learn body language. I love that advice. Ken, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to put up the coupon code for people who have watched all the way to the end. You can save 20% on Ken's book at dogwise.com. And like I said, we've only got about 20 copies in stock. Do yourself a favor, go get a copy of this book. It's absolutely fantastic. And for everyone who joined us today, thank you for joining us, Ken. I'm so grateful for your time. Dorothy wanted to say, and I agree completely with Dorothy, as always, you're a joy to listen to, Ken. So thank you all for joining us. And Ken, thank you so, so much for your time.
Thank you, Erica. Take care.